Welcome back everyone. In today's video, I have decided to rank all the currently playable characters in Ultimate Alliance 3. But these aren't just my personal rankings of all characters. I've asked different online communities to vote on who they deemed the best characters and the worst characters, and I compiled those votes to make a ranking that I will share with you today. The way everyone was asked to vote was based on how good or bad a character is on their own, outside of a specific team, while taking into consideration their individual abilities, stats, synergies, and how fun they are to play in general. After writing out all the rankings, I realized this would be an incredibly long video if I went through all 46 characters, so we'll do this in two parts. This first video will cover the lower half of the rankings, and I'll soon release part 2 showing the rankings for the best half, so stay tuned for that. But that's enough prefacing, so without further ado, let's begin with the number 46 spot. So last place was especially close in voting between two characters, and I mean real close, like one vote. Most likely when you think of the worst characters in the game, two probably come to mind. So the real question was, who did the community say was worse than the other? Well, that character was Doctor Strange. Now right here I want to take a second and say that even though we are ranking these characters and placing them in the worst or best categories, all of them are viable, and the game does a good job of balancing each character and making them useful. But some do get the short end of the stick, like Doctor Strange. For example, he unfortunately only has synergy with one of his abilities. As far as his other abilities, he has the ability to heal other characters, but healing powers are mostly useless in the game because they aren't very effective and could use a buff. Doctor Strange also has a bind power, which can be helpful in some scenarios, but in my opinion, you're usually better off just using his attacks. Unfortunately, for such a powerful character in the Marvel Universe in general, Doctor Strange is very underserved in this game. Okay, so you probably know who's next after Strange, and that is Scarlet Witch. She suffers from the same problems as Strange, another powerhouse character in the Marvel Universe, but not as effective in the game. She only has one ability that can synergize, her heal is pretty pointless, and the aura she drops to slow and damage enemies can be fun in some cases, but largely won't be used. I will say though, I really enjoy playing as her and I find her two damage abilities to be pretty satisfying. You can boost her damage by stacking mastery ISOs on her, which is something I would recommend to people playing Scarlet Witch often. Like I said before, all of these characters can be used and are fun to use, and I use Scarlet Witch a lot myself, but she might struggle in some of the harder challenges. Instead of standing on her own, you really have to build a strong team around her. Next we have Rocket and Groot. Rocket and Groot could have been really cool to play as well, since they are essentially two characters in one. However, in my experience, they feel kinda clumsy to play. The basic attack sees Rocket fire a gun in the direction you're facing, but it can be tough to aim like that. They do have an ability to synergize in what I deem to be the strongest synergy in the game, and that is the beam synergy. But you will probably go to other characters for this because again, you can't really aim it properly. From my experience, since you have to walk around to aim, you're pretty much just running around the battlefield shooting at everything somewhat aimlessly. They have other, more focused attacks, and again, you can find ways to use Rocket and Groot effectively in your team, but they're not exactly as fun gameplay-wise, and are a little underwhelming compared to all the other characters in the game. Up next, we have Drax the Destroyer. Drax is a character that isn't necessarily bad, but just doesn't stand out amongst the crowd. His attacks don't feel incredibly powerful or exciting. I think that's the main problem with Drax, is that you can usually find other characters that can do the same things, but better. I largely slept on Drax if I'm being honest, but when I revisited him, I did enjoy his moves and animations, so he could be a fun one to retry if he fell under your radar too. Now we're on to the Punisher. I actually thought Punisher would be higher on the list, but I can actually see why he's this low. Punisher has been a character I've wanted in the game since MUA 1, and he's finally here, but he doesn't play all that satisfying. He's surprisingly evasive, with two attacks that have you diving away from enemies instead of towards them, and they don't do much damage and can be tough to aim. He does have one attack that moves in on enemies, and it's an effective attack, but still not as fun. His most fun attack is his sniper shot, turning the tables on those Wakandan snipers that take half your health in one shot. It's a fun attack, but it's pretty slow and typically won't hit more than one or two enemies at a time. His heavy attack actually feels more like what one of his abilities should have been. But all of that to say that Punisher was underserved as well in this game, as far as gameplay goes. At number 41 on our list is Elsa Bloodstone. It makes sense that she is around the same ranking as Punisher, because they kinda play similar. Both are very gun-centric with a lot of single target damage. Although Elsa does have a really cool crowd control move where she fires her guns in all directions. Her moves can be more fun to play, but she has very low stagger damage on all abilities, and her attacks don't feel especially damaging in my opinion. It's a shame she's not higher on the list, since she is arguably the most obscure new character in the game, so this would have been a good place for her to really shine for new players that are seeing her for the first time. The number 40 spot belongs to Gamora, the third of 4 Guardians to be lower in the rankings unfortunately. I actually think Gamora can be pretty fun to play though, and I think she suffers from similar problems to Drax, where she doesn't quite have enough going for her to make her stand out. This could also be because we start the game with the Guardians, and with only one ability unlocked, which isn't exciting, and then we move on to all the other heroes in the game, and it takes a while for us to revisit them. Or at least that's how it went for me. Gamora is actually pretty quick and gets quite a bit of range on all of her attacks. Other characters are probably better equipped for challenges within the game, because as you'll notice with all the characters in this ranking, there's a lot of tough competition. For the most part, everyone has something appealing about their gameplay, but some just do it better. So Gamora is still a good character, just not stand out enough to be higher on the list. Keeping that trend going is number 39, Luke Cage. Cage is another one that didn't quite cut it for myself and the community, but is a good example of what I discussed with Drax, because Luke Cage plays similar to Drax, but he does it better. Luke Cage has more area of effect attacks, and he feels more powerful during these attacks. His abilities have some pretty solid stagger damage and health damage ratings on them too. When you think about his power set in general, it's not as exciting visually, but Luke manages to have some pretty cool abilities in the game. Let's now move on to Falcon. I think Falcon has some pretty fun gameplay too, and his flight is utilized well, even Red Wing. I think he has a pretty solid extreme attack as well. Unfortunately, his damage output feels kind of underwhelming. If you're debating on using Falcon, I'd recommend trying him out. He has good crowd control and his flight is helpful for challenges where you have to get to the end of the level under a certain amount of time. Overall, I think he is a fun character to play as, but you would probably sub him out for some of the more difficult challenges in the game. Number 37 is Elektra. Elektra again not doing a whole lot that stands out, but she can be an effective character still. Her attacks can do decent damage to health and stagger bars, but she's not doing a whole lot of crowd control. Her most powerful stagger attack is her Side Strike, but in my experience it's best used charged up, and since it's a close-up attack, a lot of bosses dodge out of the way before I can use it. That's kinda how I feel in general with Elektra. She does some cool attacks, but they're just not connecting as easily as I would hope. Another example is her Explosive Assault, where she launches explosive daggers into the ground, but I hardly use it because the delay on the explosion makes it tough to hit enemies. I actually really like Elektra a lot as a character in general, and I still use her in the game from time to time, but it's usually just for casual fun. Next is Morbius, another obscure character that I wish had a little more oomph to his gameplay. Morbius can be pretty fun to use though. I think he really shines in big crowds of small enemies. He can cover ground quickly through his dashing ability, and even charge enemies and drain the health of one of them. His paralyzing hypnotic gaze is an interesting ability too, and in my opinion is better than the bind ability we discussed with Doctor Strange. The downside of Morbius is he struggles during boss fights. His hypnotic gaze won't stick, and he can't tackle the bigger enemies like he can the small ones, so you mostly try to get close and spam the slash attack. In this regard, he'll be more effective in Infinity Trials like Wave, where there are large enemy counts, but not so much in boss fights. Up next is Black Widow. In my opinion, Widow plays pretty similar to Elektra and Gamora, but she's more fun to use. Her attacks cover a lot of range, so you can do damage from a distance without getting too close. Also, she has good up-close attacks. She also feels very quick and precise, which is in character and feels more fun in this game. I also think she has a great extreme attack. I don't think she'll steal the show and single-handedly take down a boss, but she is a very useful support character and fun to use. At number 34 we have Venom. I have mixed feelings about Venom. I actually enjoy playing with him a lot, but he's just really slow. He's more of a tanky character in the game, which was probably the way the developers intended him to play, but in a game as frantic as this one, slower characters can have trouble keeping up. That being said, I like the majority of his abilities, and for the most part they are really good at crowd control. He isn't super effective against bosses, but I think he can hold his own pretty well. His base stats are pretty high though, so he's definitely an effective character. I'd recommend boosting him with strength ISOs and maybe an energy ISO since that's the one stat he's really low on. Next is number 33, Iron Fist. Those of you on Discord know Iron Fist is my favorite character in-game and out, so trust me when I say that even if your favorite character doesn't make it high on this list, it's not really important. Every character can be useful and each character is fun, and you'll find ways to make them work if you're willing to take the time to learn them, and you'll probably stack them with your best ISOs. At least that's how I play Iron Fist, and I actually use him for some difficult challenges, including Danger Room. Iron Fist has a good set of abilities that do a solid amount of health and stagger damage. He also synergizes very well. I can usually trust that his abilities will have a strong synergy with someone when I use it, and it's been very helpful against stagger bars. I think why people aren't gravitating towards him is because 1, they aren't as biased like I am, and 2, he doesn't have a whole lot of range. You're mostly up close on enemies, and his only ranged ability is his Dragon Smash, where he sends a Chi Dragon forward. But yeah, I actually really enjoy Iron Fist, but he may take some getting used to, just like all the other characters on this half of the list. Our next character has some of the best stats in the game, and that is Thanos. So why is Thanos so low on our list if he has objectively great stats? Well, unfortunately, he is a bit underwhelming when it comes to fun gameplay. I think this mostly comes down to how slow he feels. His attacks are very powerful, but they take a while to execute, so I think that is why Thanos has been ranked so low. He does have one standout ability though, and that is his beam attack. The beam synergy is in my opinion the best synergy in the game. Doing this synergy will melt stagger and health bars, and Thanos is very easy to control during this synergy, so he is one of the ideal characters to use in this regard. I also reached out to Discord and Reddit user Zyro77, our local Thanos expert, for his opinion on what makes Thanos great. He added that Thanos is number 1 when it comes to base health, strength, and mastery stats before even adding ISOs, which gives Thanos a massive advantage from the start. Zyro further adds that since Thanos has such high mastery, this is why his I-Beam is such a powerhouse ability in the game. I personally agree with everything Zyro has stated, and I think his I-Beam might be one of the reasons he's ranked lower in the game, and it could be because it overshadows his other abilities. In my experience, the majority of my gameplay with Thanos is using the beam, which is satisfying to use, but might feel a bit redundant down the line for most players. And since his other abilities are kinda slow, you aren't really rewarded for mixing up Thanos' abilities. So I think that's why he's lower on the list, but overall, he is still a valuable asset to any team. Coming in at number 31, we have Spider-Gwen. Spider-Gwen is fun to use and is especially good at crowd control. A lot of her abilities cover a wide area, and in my experience, she synergizes well. I really love her basic attacks too, and I feel like they pack more of a wallop than most other characters. I don't quite think she stands out against a couple of her other Spider-Verse members, but Gwen is a solid character. She may just lack the damage output that many players need during some of the harder missions, so even though Spider-Gwen is lower in this list, she can still be very useful, especially in challenges where you face a large number of enemies, like in wave trials. Next up is Loki, a bit of a mixed bag as well in my opinion. Most of his votes cancelled out, with many people saying he was one of the best, and many saying he was one of the worst. He has some really unique abilities and they fit his character well. He has good damage, especially with his ice attribute, but his stagger is almost non-existent. To mention, his attack animations feel really slow as he summons other versions of himself. I do like his attacks and I can see why people gravitate towards him, but ultimately, I think he's better as a support character, which I think is why he's lower on the list. At number 29, we have another character that can take some getting used to, and that is Daredevil. Daredevil is another one of my favorite characters from Marvel in general, so I felt a little let down with Daredevil's moveset in this game. His abilities fit his character well since he is an up-close brawler, but in this game it feels like he needs more range. Maybe an ability where he can ricochet his billy club similar to Cap's shield would be helpful. But as for his actual abilities, he is very up close and stationary, so it can be tricky to line him up properly, and it's frustrating when the enemies dodge the ability and you're stuck in the animation. But if you can time it right, he deals out good damage, especially when paired with his awesome radar sense ability, where you can increase the damage taken by enemies that are within the pulse. I think that this is his standout ability and makes him valuable to a team. I also like to bump up his attacks by stacking him with strength ISOs. Number 28 is Ghost Rider. I think Ghost Rider is another character that is meant to be more of a tankier character. In fact, he is probably one of the best characters to use as a tank, since his base defensive stats are so high. His movements are slower, but he's hard to knock down. And although I usually knock slower characters, Ghost Rider makes it work. He has fantastic stagger damage and good crowd control. I've also found him to synergize really well too. His Hell Cycle ability allows you to get to enemies really quickly while leaving a damaging trail of Hellfire, although the Hell Cycle animation is especially slow. But even though he's not as agile as other characters, he's especially resilient to punishment and can take a beating while handing out his own. Next on our list is the Swashbuckler Nightcrawler. The opposite of Ghost Rider, Nightcrawler is especially quick and can make up distance fast, as you might expect with his teleportation ability. Similar to Morbius, Nightcrawler can quickly get to enemies all over the battlefield, but Nightcrawler excels at it far more. All of his abilities are useful and none of them feel disappointing. In general, his damage is good, but his stagger is pretty low. I would still recommend Nightcrawler though, because you have a lot of control over how evasive or aggressive you want to be, and oftentimes you can be both. His teleportation is also really helpful in Danger Room trials, requiring you to get from one end of the map to the other before the timer expires. At rank 26, we have the Master of Magnetism, Magneto. Magneto can be a lot of fun to use and can overwhelm enemies at a distance, and you'll mostly want to stay at a distance because Magneto doesn't have a whole lot of defense and is mostly a controlling presence and damage dealer. I say controlling presence because he has a gravity bomb ability that can draw enemies into a desired location or send them away from you. This can be really helpful when trying to get enemies together right before a big focused attack like an Extreme. So even though Magneto is lower on the overall list, he's still a great character to implement. At 25, we have another character with mixed opinions, but one of my personal favorites, Hawkeye. So I can totally understand why Hawkeye is lower on the list, because he doesn't pack much of a punch individually when it comes to damage. Like Magneto, Hawkeye is best used from a distance, and his abilities pretty much require this because he has no close-up attacks, since they are all ranged. The reason I personally enjoy Hawkeye is because of how evasive he is. He's especially slippery and hard for enemies to touch. I typically will send out an ability, dodge, then send out another ability, and kind of work the room, dodging, jumping around, setting traps, and overall peppering damage onto enemies and bosses. I've also found that he synergizes well with a lot of his abilities. So yeah, even though his health isn't great and his damage output isn't especially high, his gameplay is one of the best in my opinion as far as uniqueness, and you can really work the battlefield. Barely missing out on the top half of the list is our next character, Moon Knight. And I think to fully appreciate Moon Knight, you need to play around with his abilities a little bit, because they're varied and aren't incredibly fast. What I like to do with Moon Knight is what I call get in, get out, get back in. So you can charge in maybe with a crescent kick, then use Vengeance Burst to evade backwards while attacking by throwing crescent darts, then quickly make up the distance with the moon landing to get back into the fight. I found that this makes his character feel faster, and it feels like you can cover a lot of ground with Moon Knight. I use him a lot in Danger Room, and I think his moon landing is especially good at synergizing with other abilities on the field and does some really good stagger damage. Plus, Moon Knight's Cape Glide is incredibly fast and can be really useful in those get to the end of the map challenges in Danger Room. But those are all the characters the community ranked into the lower half of the list. In the next video, we'll pick up with number 23 and work our way down to number 1. I'll release that video as soon as I finish it, so keep an eye out for that soon. I just want to mention again that even though the characters listed today are ranked in the lower half of the game, that shouldn't dissuade you from using them. My personal favorite character is at rank 33, and I still use him for everything. All characters are viable, especially when you build them up using ISOs and place them in a solid team, so you shouldn't concern yourself too much with the meta, and instead I would recommend playing whoever you find the most fun. However, if you are looking for more unique and competitive characters, the next list will cover all of those. In the meantime, if you're looking for people to play with online, you can join us on Discord where a lot of us are actively looking for lobbies. I'll have a link in the description below, but that's all for this video. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.